welcome. Thank you for joining me for a Bible study. In our first episode, we're going to begin a study of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. The primary text that we're going to be using for this study is Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. Today, before we get into looking at the details of the sermon itself, I'd like to spend this episode giving an overall summary about the purpose of this lesson of Jesus. First of all, consider a couple of details about the sermon itself. This is the longest recorded teaching of Jesus we have in the New Testament. Luke's account of this sermon places it in about the second year of Jesus' ministry. By the time we get into the second year of Jesus' ministry, he is popular. He's famous. People from as far away as Syria are beginning to pour into the northern part of Israel, the region of Galilee. Out of great curiosity about this man that can heal the sick and gives a very strange and unusual teaching. There's a lot of curiosity that people have as they're coming to learn about who Jesus is for the very first time. The sermon itself, and in the conclusion of it, the reaction that the people have to the sermon, we find that the sermon helps solidify the authority of Jesus. After Jesus preached this sermon, the crowd reacts by recognizing that Jesus is not just like all the other teachers in Israel. He's not just another rabbi giving a dissertation about the law of Moses. Jesus is different. In Matthew chapter 8, in the aftermath of this sermon, everyone who has any interaction with Jesus at all appeals to Jesus based upon his authority. The theme of the sermon is the gospel of the kingdom. Jesus is explaining what God's kingdom means, what it's going to mean in the world, what it's going to mean in the lives of people who come to know it, what it's going to mean in the future. There are many, many misconceptions which abound among the Jews about God's kingdom, as there are many misconceptions today among us. Yet Jesus is trying to convey the truth concerning God's kingdom that he, as the Messiah, is now establishing. The message of Jesus here is not about happiness. Some have viewed this sermon as sort of a how-to guide for being happy, having a good and happy life. Jesus may bring us happiness, but what he offers is far deeper than happiness. Jesus is trying to bring about holiness in the lives of God's creation. It's not just a set of rules. This is a template for how the purposes of God are going to be unleashed in the world. And for that reason, what Jesus says here in this sermon is absolutely transformative in every sense of the word. Well, now let's begin to just summarize Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. In Matthew chapter 5, in the opening 16 verses, Jesus gives us the Beatitudes. There's a set of traits that he describes. What are the Beatitudes all about? Well, broadly, what Jesus is doing is explaining to us what it means to be human, what being human is supposed to look like in God's creation. When God created man, he created man as the absolute pinnacle of everything else that he'd made. And this is known mainly in the fact that God gave man his image. We are God's image bearers in the world. Therefore, he charges Adam and Eve, as they are now married, to reproduce and to subdue creation. And through that, they're able to reflect God's glory out into the world. Adam and Eve do this for a time, but of course they sin. They turn to idolatry and express that idolatry through specific acts of sin. And that is the general way that idolatry happens and is practiced even today. When we turn away from our Creator and begin serving ourselves, serving our own desires, we express that service through specific acts of sin. What God is trying to do through the Messiah and the Messiah's kingdom is to get creation back in order, to create unity and harmony with God's creation and with God's creation to himself. Jesus in the Beatitudes is telling us how that can happen through a transformation of heart and mind, one person at a time. But the Beatitudes are not just about personal transformation. The Beatitudes will affect how we interact and engage with other people. In the rest of the 5th chapter, Jesus describes various ways in which we interact with other people morally and ethically. Mainly, there are 6 points that Jesus makes in the balance of chapter 5. Number 1, he states in summary, instead of violence, we're supposed to promote the kingdom through love. Number 2, we're supposed to treat our fellow man not as senseless and worthless, but with dignity and respect. If we harm our fellow man, we're supposed to seek reconciliation with them. Number 3, we're supposed to learn self-control. Self-control is the result of us coming to the understanding that our heart is what shapes us. Our heart is where either sin begins or holiness is produced. Number 4, Jesus talks about marital fidelity. Marital fidelity represents the harmony of God. This is one of the ways that as God's creation, we are to reflect His glory in having a loving relationship between a husband and a wife. Number 5, Jesus stresses that we're supposed to practice honesty in all situations in our lives. And lastly, he states how we are to engage with our enemies. Yes, there are some who will seek to do us wrong for the simple reason that we are trying to do what is right. How are we supposed to treat our enemies? Jesus says, most challengingly, we are supposed to love our enemies. And the way in which we love them and respond to them is supposed to exemplify the way in which God, by love, has responded to us in a state of hostility. Moving on to chapter 6, Jesus identifies 3 barriers that we create which prevent us from the kingdom and prevent us from experiencing the love of God. Number 1, Jesus talks about self-righteousness. Self-righteousness was noticed among the Pharisees and the way they had corrupted worship. Jesus identifies some areas in which they had used to, instead of exalting God, exalting themselves. And they did this through charity, through prayer and fasting. All of those 3 acts were right and good acts to perform. But those acts were not about exalting one's reputation in the community. Those acts were about a demonstration that they were the people of God, a demonstration of God's love. Self-righteousness will always prevent us from experiencing the love of God. They will always keep us out of the kingdom. Secondly, Jesus identifies materialism as being another barrier that keeps us from the kingdom. It is very easy for us to become obsessive, consumed with life in this world and acquiring material possessions, trying to find fulfillment through those things. Jesus warns that material possessions will only, the pursuit of material possessions will harm us. They will create anxiety, which is the 3rd barrier that Jesus identifies. It's no accident that Jesus talks about anxiety in connection with materialism. These things will keep us from the kingdom. They will prevent our faith from growing to the extent that it must. They will render us useless in kingdom service. And lastly, as we come to the 7th chapter, Jesus tells us that we are not to use self-righteous and hypocritical judgment against our fellow man. Instead, we are supposed to show love to them as we seek their salvation. Those who are living in sin do not need a judge. They already have a judge. What our role is to be is ministers of God's mercy, that we are to seek a renewal, a change of heart and mind in the lives of those living in sin. Dealing with those who are living in sin is very sensitive work. What is to best aid us in this work is first having dealt with our own sin. If we first deal with our sin, then we recognize the delicate nature of repentance and the love that is required to seeing that happen in the life of someone else. Jesus states, in effect, that we're to use the golden rule to guide us and how we seek to deal with the sin of other people. And then as we move a little further into the 7th chapter, Jesus makes the point that we have some choices to make. Jesus' message was not just something to talk about. He was not just giving his views about the old law. Jesus is telling us that we have to choose what we're going to do with his message. Jesus intends his message to be lived, and there's a consequence for what we choose to do with it. He says there, he clarifies our choices into two paths. We can choose to take a broad path, which is popular, which requires nothing. It requires no sacrifice, but it ultimately leads to destruction. Or in life, we can choose a narrow path that demands self-discipline, self-control. It demands sacrifice. But if we get on that path, it leads to life, a very different outcome. But Jesus warns that we have to be careful in how we make our choices. There are false teachers who will cloud our judgment in choosing the correct path. And then lastly, Jesus illustrates the choice with a parable. He talks about two men who built houses. One man built his house upon a rock, and the other built his house upon the sand. When the storms came to both of these men's homes, the man whose house was founded upon a rock withstood the storm, while the man who built his house on the sand, his house was destroyed. So, ladies and gentlemen, this Sermon on the Mount is certainly worth our consideration. Its principles being applied in our lives is urgent. This is the means whereby our character can be transformed, whereby we can come into harmony with God and his kingdom and help promote the causes of his kingdom in the world. I hope you will take some time to read this sermon. In our next episode, we are going to begin a study of the Beatitudes, looking at the first 16 verses of Matthew 5. I hope you'll join me then. Thank you for listening, and have a nice day.